All right, so today I'm going to talk about DeepSkyStacker, and if we have time, Affinity Photo, which is a nice image processing program, kind of like Photoshop. I want to thank everyone for coming. If there's any questions up front, I'll start with those. Otherwise, I'll just jump right into the demo of DeepSkyStacker.
Is
All right,
DeepSkyStacker even maintained anymore, actually?
it is. There's a group that is making some feature enhancements, but mostly bug fixing it. So I was surprised, but yeah, it's still going. And as I was telling everyone before, I hadn't used it for a while. It hadn't really changed much. It kind of, if you could figure it out before, it pretty much does the same thing now. All right, let's see if this works for me today. Share screen. Let's see. Let's do that one. No, this one. Sorry. You'll probably see yourselves first. There we go. You're probably seeing yourselves, aren't you? All right. Do you see DeepSkyStacker yet?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, it looks like it. Yeah, that's it. 4.2.5. Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
This. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So, if you've never used it, it's a pretty nicely laid out program. Everything you need to do is over here. Can you see my mouse cursor on the left?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So pretty much you just go through these steps almost sequentially. The most important thing to do, which is in red up here, is to load your picture files. And here I have this data set that I put up on Google Drives. And in this case, I'm going to start with it says right here, open your light frame. So these are the frames you took of the object. And I put those in this directory called M45. And I have 8 frames. I took these back, 2010 in Georgia at a star party. So when you load frames, you'll see them. They're loaded down here in this list of the files. Has the file name, the file type. So these are light frames. And then you just go through all your files. So next I'm going to hit my darks. So let me go back to, all right, there we go. And darks, and I'm going to load all my darks. And here they loaded up. And the important thing is just that they loaded as dark frames, which you can see right here. The other things you can look at, and you'll notice I have a problem because it's an old data set. I couldn't quite put it together right, and I haven't used a DSLR for a long time. So over here, this column is exposure. So I have some 3-minute light frames and 5-minute darks, and that's going to cause a slight problem, but it works well enough for this demo. Also, this column is ISO. So here's all my ISOs match at 800. And they're all raw frames. And you always want to work with raw if you can. You don't want to use your camera and save JPEGs. JPEGs, when it creates a JPEG image, the camera does a lot of things to the image that makes it so you can't really stack them anymore. So the raws preserve all the information you need. All right, I'm going to get the rest of these files. Why does it keep going back here? All right. So, I'm sorry. I'm used to using dark flats or flat darks, same thing. I'm used to using those, but actually with this old data set, I was using bias frames. So now the difference is of flat dark or dark flat. There's no agreement on what to call them. Those are frames that are darks that are the same length as your flats. And those are important with especially these modern CMOS cameras. A bias is a dark, but it's only 0 seconds long. And traditionally those have been used with flats, but we're finding that flat darks work better with these new CMOS cameras. And they should work with DSLRs. And lastly, I need my flats.
Aren't bias frames typically going for CCDs more than anything these days?
Yeah, what you need those for is if you're going to scale darks mostly, which doesn't work with CMOS cameras. What am I doing? Flats? Yeah. Yeah, traditionally you would take bias and then you would take, let's say, a 5-minute, a 10-minute, and a 15-minute, and a 20-minute dark. And then when you process your CCDs, it would figure out the bracketing exposures and then scale the darks. But that just doesn't work with CMOS cameras. All right, so if I pull this up, you can see I have my flats, biases, darks, and lights. So we've got all our data loaded. And one nice thing about this program is this little option right here. It says save the file list. So I went through all this trouble to load this. If I do that, I've already done it once. But if you give it a file name here like I did up here, it'll save a file, a text file that lists all the files in your project. If you had to shut down and come back later, you would hit open file list. All right, I'm not going to do it because it'll change what I'm doing here. But in that case, you would load that text file back in and it would load everything up and you'd be ready to go. So if you're shooting a object over several nights, that's really handy because you can load the previous project and just add the new files to it. Clear list here will clear out everything. I don't want to do that. Now, when you load the light frames, you'll notice on the far left, there's this column of check marks. And if a file is checked, it'll be used. Now, I don't recall why. It's been a long time. But for some reason, light frames are not checked by default. As you'll see, these top 8 frames, if you look over here in this column, they say they're light frames. They're not checked. So what I usually do first is hit check all. And you'll see that they now checked. Again, I don't recall the reason it's like that. I just know that you have to do this step to get them. So then the next step we need to do is go through our settings. And that's down here under options. The first set of settings are these for RAW and FITS files. So if you're using a DSLR, it's going to be creating RAW files. If you use a Canon, they're CR2 files. I don't know what Nikon calls theirs, but that would be the native RAW file created by the camera, like if you had it write it out to the SD card. FITS files are generally created by programs like SG Pro, Voyager, etc. And they're associated with a dedicated astronomy camera. With a RAW file, there's a header on each of those RAW files. It'll tell it if it's a color, and generally they're almost always color. They're or monochrome because they came from a DSLR. With FITS files, you would have to go through and fill out a lot of things because that info is not available. So for what I'm talking about today, we're talking about DSLRs. So we're only going to worry about the RAW files tab here. And really, there's nothing that you need to click on in this screen. I have a text document in that zip file I put out that shows all the settings I used today, but where you may need to change things would be this white balance area. I had a modified camera for this stuff, so this didn't apply, but if you had an unmodified camera and you wanted to use the white balance from the camera, this might work. And this is an area that I'll just simply say, if you try it and it doesn't work, let me know. We'll work through it. But a lot of those emails probably on the DSS list are about how to get white balance to work properly, because I struggled with it a bit. Let's see. This bottom area is basically how does it convert the raw data into a color image? And I'm just going to use the defaults today. It explains what these other options are for. You may need those, but generally you can just use the defaults here. The other settings, there's the stacking settings. So I clicked on, it's a little weird. Some of these labels are just labels. Some of them, when you go over them, they look like a link, and they're actually a link. So these are all the settings for stacking. So again, I have that text document shows pictures of all the screens, but I'll just go through these for the video so I can document it that way. This first screen just shows what happens when it stacks the image. What does it do? Does it crop it down to the reference? That's what it's showing here. The result of the stack will be the reference frame. So if you had frames that were not guided well, or things drifted, it's just going to crop out the center. And in this mosaic mode, it would show everything. So if you're shooting a mosaic and stitching things together, that might be helpful. And then the intersection will only output the common area shared by these 3 frames. So I usually leave it on standard. I try to guide and not let things drift out of frame. It has these 2 drizzle options, which are a little bit beyond this talk, but that's a way to enhance the resolution of undersampled image maybe you took with a camera lens. It makes the files much bigger and it takes a lot longer, but it does work and it's kind of handy, but not something we'll discuss today. Down here at the bottom, I usually leave this use all available processors. It'll speed things up. One of the nice things about DSS back in the day was it did comet stacking. That again, I'm not going to talk about today, but we were just going to leave it on standard. We're not trying to track a comet or anything. For light frames, there's several options here. These are all control pixel rejection. A common question people have when they start imaging is, let's say a satellite went through one of their frames and, they're like, do I have to throw this frame away now? And the answer is no. Let's say you took 10 frames and only one of them had the satellite trail, well, these routines will analyze all the pixels and notice that in one frame there's outlier pixels, and it'll just replace those with either a median or an average of the other frames. So these are really important. Today I'm just going to keep it simple and leave it on average. The other thing that I missed until today when I was looking at it again is this RGB channel background calibration. This is not just a label, it's actually a button. So if we click on that, we have all these options. If you go to the DSS website, it talks about how they work. I'm just going to set it on none today. That worked best for me, but it didn't. It's probably not the right answer for all situations. Again, this is just a simple walkthrough to help someone who's never used it get their data loaded up and get a first effort. But this is a button that you would probably need to read the website and talk to people about for your camera with your data, what you might want to use there. Mostly what it affects is the color of the background. And I'll show you that once we've stacked some data. Here's how is it going to stack your darks? And again, I just use the default, it's going to take a median. How to stack the flats, how to stack the bias. Again, this default works well. This is how is it going to align the frames? There was a time where these other options were important. The automatic has been debugged and works really well, and I would just leave it on automatic. The intermediate files tells it, one thing you could do is if you wanted to write out each frame as it's calibrated. So what's a calibrated frame? You have your raw frames, and those just came straight out of the camera. Calibrated frames have had the darks and the flats applied to them. There may be a reason you want to look at those and do something with them, but generally I leave it off. That can create a lot of disk space. Likewise, this check button. The thing you probably want to care about is down here. What kind of final file will it write out? Is it going to write out a TIFF or a FITS file? I'm just going to have it write out a TIFF file because Affinity Photo probably doesn't know what a FITS file is. If you were going to another program that was more focused on astronomy and knew what FITS files were, you probably want to use FITS files. But if you're going to load this in GIMP or Photoshop or Affinity Photo or some other image editor, you want to set this TIFF file. This cosmetic settings, basically this will go through and try to find hot and cold pixels. Hot pixel is a pixel that's always lit up, even if there's no light hitting the sensor. It's just an electronic aberration. Cold pixels are ones that are just not very sensitive to light, and they're always dark, no matter how much light you hit them with. So this could be interesting, you know, to clean up frames, especially with the DSLR that's taken on a hot night when you have a lot of thermal noise in the camera. But I'm not going to talk about that today. That's the next level of DSS. And then finally, the output settings. So usually it's just going to write a file called autosave.tiff in the directory where your light frames were. And if there's one there already, if you have this checkbox right here checked, then it will just write one with 001, 002, etc. So it won't overwrite the frame. If you turn this off, it will overwrite previous files. So I would generally leave this checked. Down here controls where that file gets written. If you wanted it to go in a particular directory, you could click on this and tell it, but I'm just going to let it write it out in the same folder as the light frames. All right, so that was a bunch to take in. You can go back through the video, and I'm going to try to get that video up today or tomorrow. Finally, there's a nice thing they added. There's these recommended settings. All right, so what it's saying is if something is in green, then that setting is already set. And they also tell you this may not work in all situations, but they're a good starting point. So bilinear debayering, I'm doing that. If you're using narrowband, so if you put a H alpha filter in front of a DSLR, you're only going to get red pixels, for example, because H alpha only lets the red light through for that emission line. In that case, you would want to switch over to this other mode, but we're not doing that. It says here, if you're using bias frames, set this black point. Well, I tried it both ways and it worked better without setting this black point. So again, these are recommended, but don't always work. So I'm just bringing this up to let you know this screen is here to give you some ideas, but I'm going to go with the settings I found worked best. There's a lot of information. I mean, DSS has been out over a decade. So if you go on Cloudy Nights and other places, you will find a lot of people talking about this. And I'll be happy to try to help out as well. But any of these software that does stacking is going to have a large number of settings that at first are a bit overwhelming. But the fortunate thing is you rarely ever change them. Once you figure out the settings for your particular camera and telescope, those will generally work forever. So it's an initial learning curve. All right, so we got everything loaded up. We checked our light frames, checked all the settings. All that's left to do is this button right here. It says stack checked pictures. So you hit that, and another screen comes up, and it kind of summarizes all the settings. Tells me I have 8 offset or bias frames that are ISO 800. You'll notice they're a thousandth of a second. My DSLR doesn't do a 0-second exposure, so you just do the fastest your camera supports. Some of the newer ones may do 4,000th or faster. That's what you'd want to use. 8 dark frames, again, 800 ISO. And then got 8 flats down here. And then up here, we got 8 light frames. Let's see. It tells you the total exposure time. And it tells you how much disk space it'll use, all this stuff. One thing here that's kind of interested, these 2 buttons down here are the same buttons I showed you earlier. And you just hit OK. So right now what it's doing, it tells you right here in this title, it's creating a offset frame. That's a bias. Now it's creating the dark, the master dark, which is when it combines all the darks into a single dark. Now it's doing the flat. And down here, it may be hard to read on Zoom, but it's giving me a time estimate of everything. So now it's stacking all the frames. Now we had 8 frames, so it's pretty quick. If you had a bunch of frames, obviously it's going to take a little longer, but and then it will load that final frame up. All right, so this is now the final frame. the stacked image. This little doohickey down here is a tool that if you wanted to, you could try to stretch the image before you saved it. I don't generally use that, but that's something if you wanted to play with, we could talk about, once you start doing that. But the important thing is it already saved the data. I'm going to go over to Affinity now. Let me know if that popped up.
Yep. That's there.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to load up a frame I did previously. So if you haven't used Affinity, again, this is a very complicated and sophisticated program, and it has a lot of settings. We're not going to use most of them, but the first thing you got to do is load up that light frame. And so if you look here, this is the top level directory of that zip file I created. And there's a directory. So there's a directory called docs. You can't see anything in it, I don't think, because it doesn't recognize it. But there is a kind of a Word document there. The original data is where we were loading in our light, flats, darks, and bias. If you look in this light directory, you'll see there's an autosave.tiff there now. So that's where the output from DSS went. So I'll just load that one up right now. All right, so I did this on a modified camera, and so the colors are going to be a bit skewed. And that's the first thing we have to address. Now, there's these buttons up here that probably work great in the daytime when you have like a normal scene, but nighttime scenes with a really black background. So for reference, the background, I don't know how well it shows up for you guys, but there's a bit of a red tint to everything.
Red. Yeah.
In
red.
purple.
Yes.
If you know this object, the background's black, and these sort of reflection areas would be blue. Generally a blue and black, and then there's some a brown, reddish, rust color of dust, kind of around here. So if I just go and hit auto white balance, yeah, as you can see, it didn't do a whole lot. If I try auto colors, is that going to fix it? No, didn't do a whole lot. We'll try auto levels. So that did do something interesting. What it did, and I don't know how well you can see it, but there's this histogram up here in the corner. Before, it's very hard to see, but you'll see the red, the green, and the blue histograms aren't overlapping. And that's because there's an offset between the red, the green, and the blue channels. And that's why the screen looks red, because the red is at an average higher level than the others. What I think this auto levels does is it tries to pull them together somewhat. And kind of there's three peaks in the histogram, one for the green, the red, and the blue. And it looks like it's trying to make them agree. So the background is now more of a gray color. Now, again, there's a lot going on in Affinity. This area here is where you'll be looking at most. These are the layers. And if you've used Photoshop, you're familiar with the idea of layers. The idea is, for example, if I just made a new layer, and I don't know Affinity very well, so this will be fun. I think I know how to do this. All right. If I just start drawing, you're going to go like, what'd you do to your image? Well, that's on this layer. You can maybe see this picture here. Each layer has a checkbox. If I turn off, and it all stacks top down. So if I turn off my original picture, all we see is what I drew in red on this layer. And then this weird checkerboard is basically, let's consider that infinity. That's just telling you there's no pixel data there. That's a standard pattern. So we're looking through this layer. If I keep drawing, it'll draw on this layer. And if I turn that bottom layer back on, it's like stacking pieces of paper on the table. Except These pieces of paper can be translucent. There's this thing called opacity here. It's at 100%, meaning it's completely opaque. If I slide it down, you can see we can start seeing through. So it's like we had a translucent piece of paper instead. Now, why would you draw on top of your image like this? Well, obviously that's not what this is for, but it's extremely powerful. It lets you build up different modifications to the image in different areas. And a lot of that's beyond what, I could go into today, but I just want to explain these layers.
Yeah, I usually put like my image data on a layer so that, like the source data, the designing your image piece. That'd be a good example of something to put on a different layer.
Right. So the nice thing here is that they have different types of layers that are called, okay, so there's all these buttons across the bottom here. This one, it's a circle, half circle, half lit, called adjustments. Again, a lot of things here, but these are adjustments to the pixel data. And we're just going to go with something simple right now. We're going to use one called exposure. And you'll see it put an exposure layer on top of my pixel data, this background data. The exposure layers are modifiers. They don't actually they're not pixel, they don't have any picture data in them. They're just a modifier. This one, if you slide it to the right, makes things brighter, and to the left makes things darker. So we'll just brighten things up a little and close it. And now, again, the the original pixel data hasn't been changed. What we're seeing is it takes that data, pushes it through this filter, this adjustment on top, and then displays it on the screen. And we can see that because if I hit the check mark for that layer and disable it, oops, sorry, we can see our original data is still there. This is just a filter that's modifying it. Now this is nice because imagine instead if we brightened the original pixel data and that overwrote the original, and then we did like 10 other steps to it and we decided we didn't like it. We'd have to undo everything all the way back to the beginning to get the original data. This way, we never modified the original.
So for the purposes of, for those that use PixInsight, this would be considered linear versus nonlinear data, right? Essentially, right? Because it's a layer. It's not modifying the original data at all. It's just displaying differently, right?
Yeah. Well, this is more like that screen transfer function, the STF, right? Where you're previewing what it would look like, but you haven't actually changed it yet. When you save the image, it'll combine all of these steps and make a final image. That's called flattening, right? So the background looks a little bright, so I'm going to use a tool called levels. And then here you can see the histograms. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I'm going to put that on RGB. So what it's showing, excuse me, there's a blue histogram you might be able to see here. There's the red and there's a green. And where the three overlap, it makes it white. Now there's this drop down box right here. It says master right now. So it's showing all the data at once. If I click on red, it's only showing me the red histogram and I'm only modifying the red histogram. Green and blue. So you see the green and the blue are kind of on top of each other, but red is shifted over here. So the way we can fix that, there's these sliders, black level, white level, gamma. The black level is basically setting the floor for the image. If I slide this black slider over, you'll see it gets darker because anything to the left of this line is going to be turned into black. So if I go far enough, right, it's pretty much everything is black except for the stars and some of the brighter features. And this is only doing the red channel. So that's why everything turned to green, blue, because I've taken all the red out of the image. Obviously, you don't want to do that. What we want to do is slide it over till we've gotten rid of most of that red. And the other way to see that is on this histogram here. For some reason, it's very tiny. I don't know how to, I don't know how to expand this area, but if I go back to the black channel is at its original place, you'll see this red channel is peeking out on the right. As I clip into the red channel, and you'll see that that peak is shifting to the left, and now it's mostly aligned. If I go back to the master here, it doesn't update this display for some reason, but the main thing I wanted to do is to pull in this red a little bit and line it up and get rid of a little of the red in the background. Now we could go and also darken the background on the master. Then it will be cutting into red, green, and blue equally. And then we can darken the background some. So again, all that tool did was I turned it off. I'm going to turn that layer back on. You'll see we got rid of a lot of the red and darkened the background. But it probably still show up, and I think this might be an artifact of the darks I use, but it didn't flat field quite right, and it's kind of a red in this area and kind of black on the edges. Well, if I was in PixInsight, I could fix this with something called DBE very trivially, but we don't have those tools in Affinity Photo. So you have a couple choices at this point. You could crop. You could just crop out those corners. And I'll just show you how to do that now. I don't know where I just know the hotkey. I don't know which menu it is, but it's C for crop. And it throws up this nice box with the 1/3 lines. And each corner has a little place you can grab. If you grab there and resize, it keeps the same aspect, meaning the ratio of the sides stays the same. If you grab it on the sides, however, it does not, right? So it'll scrunch your image. So, oh dear. There we go. So I would grab it in the corner, pull it in, and then you can just click in the middle and move it around. So let's just say we're going to crop it down to something like that. It's a little hidden, but there's a button up in the corner where you can apply it. So I'll undo that step so you can see what happened. That's the original. And here's cropped. So we sort of took care of those problems. We still have a problem. You can see this is probably a flat problem because it's dark in the corners and brighter in the middle. And that's an example of probably vignetting. I took this on a fast Newtonian, so there's a pretty stark light drop off towards your corners, and the flats didn't quite correct that. So there's a tool in Affinity that can help us with that, but it's a filter. And so the filters under this menu, and there's a bunch of them, these have to operate on a pixel data. They don't operate as adjustment layers. See, the adjustment layers is stacked on top of the pixel data. So our choices are to either try to run it on the original data, but another option is let's just create a new layer that is all these layers combined and just put it on top of everything. To do that, you first hit copy flattened. So it's going to flatten the existing layers and put that in the clipboard. And then I'm just going to do a paste. And now you'll see this new layer on top. If I turn that layer off, nothing changes because it's essentially everything below it combined into a new layer. And it is covering up all these layers now. So that was kind of a destructive change to the original data. Now it's still down here, but for now on, if we change any of these layers, like if I went in as levels and started playing with it, nothing's going to happen because it's all being hidden by this new layer I created. Now I'm going to select that layer, and then I'm going to go run a filter called Remove Vignette. Now what does this do? Well, it's going to brighten the colors, the corners. So if you go too far, you'll see that's what it's doing. It's making the corners brighter. obviously that's not the right answer. What I found is it's very sensitive. If you click in this box where it says 1% and use your mouse wheel, you can move it up 1% at a time. I'm probably going to go with, let's just go with 2%. Kind of brighten up the corners now. This this is showing a real-time preview. There's a couple options. One is full screen. If you hit split screen, then the one on the right is the original and the one on the left is the modified. And there's a mirror. So the one on, it's the same area of the image. The one on the right is the original data. The one on the left is the modified. And you can see how we kind of brightened up this corner. You just hit apply. Now there's still a bit of a red tint in the background. There's lots of ways to handle that. The simplest would probably be to use a different kind of adjustment layer. I'm not going to go through all of these, but levels is good for if you want to darken the black point. Vibrance is good if you want to increase the saturation of the image. Exposure is a really easy way to brighten it, but you can use that. It's a very crude tool, and for astronomy data, it's probably not the best one. Shadows and highlights let you independently affect the brightest and darkest areas. Shadows is really useful for bringing out faint features. Curves is a real workhorse. I would probably be doing everything in curves if I were doing this. It's a very flexible tool. Basically, here's your histogram, and the bottom is the input color or brightness. So this would be black, and that would be white. The y-axis is the output. So let's grab it in the middle and pull it down. What it's saying is for all of these input colors up to halfway, we're going to output a value much less, right? Because a straight line would be mapping things 1 to 1. The input and the output are the same. If we push it up, it makes the output brighter than the input. Down makes it dimmer. So generally to stretch an image, you would just pop this guy up. And then to avoid blowing out the brightest things, you would pull this down. You can't really see it on this. You can see what happens to the cores of these stars. If I pull this down, they get smaller. If I push it up, they get bigger. So generally you try to pull this down. And then the last step would be to just darken the background with levels. Again, just grab the black point and kind of darken it to some. So again, there's some issues in the background. A quick fix for that is to do something like, you could try Selective Color. This is really handy for narrowband. But what you do here is for this little drop down, these are all the colors in the image, red, yellows, greens, etc. We're going to pick the blacks because that's the closest to this background area. So what this says is for all the blacks in the image, and that's a very wide black-like colors. So that would be grays, dark grays, and dark red, greens, and blues. Let's, oh, it's very sensitive. Let's take out some of the magenta and some of the, let's add in a little cyan. And let's see, maybe subtract a little yellow. And then down here on the blacks, we can make it a little darker. Because this is how much, this is basically adding or subtracting black from the black-like colors in the image, the dark colors in the image. So that's essentially another way to darken it. So I took out some magenta, a little yellow, and added a little blue to the background, essentially. And again, there are some issues with the background in this image that would take more steps to crank through. One thing you can do is, let's say I think that did too much to the image. We can go back to this opacity layer. When it's at 100%, it's saying apply this layer to its full effect. If I put that at 0, it's basically multiplying that layer by 0 and nothing happened. If I said 50%, then it's using half of the effect. So whenever you do an operation, you can use this to sort of dial in a good mix of the previous data and the new data that you're trying to blend in. So that's another useful feature in Affinity Photo, Photoshop, the GIMP, they all have this. Now that was a lot to go through, and I'll just review it real quick, and then I'm going to kind of stop there because to get deeper into Affinity Photo, I think probably is only useful once you've kind of learned how to do these sort of steps. So the first thing I did was I loaded in this background layer. I'm going to turn off all the layers so we can kind of see what we did to get here. So that was our original data that came out of DeepSkyStacker. The first thing I did was an exposure adjustment to sort of brighten things up. I also ran this guy right here, auto levels. I applied that to the background level to try to make the background more neutral. I then did this levels adjustment here where no, why is it doing that? Oh, it's this layer.
Yeah, that's the one you did when you did your
Right.
demo of it. Yeah.
Right. Essentially, I tried to darken the red a little by adjusting its black point, and then I darkened the whole image a bit. I did another curves to brighten it up. I then used the levels to darken the background. And then I used this tool called Selective Colors to adjust the tint of the background to try to take out some of that red. Now, as a result of that, you notice the corners are now a little brighter. If you wanted, you could do this trick where you copy everything into a layer and then use, this would be kind of silly. There's a tool called Vignette, which will actually add vignetting. And you can kind of use that to sort of dial the corner. What that's doing is either makes the corners brighter or darker. Oh, that's interesting. So you could use this to remove vignetting too. Anyway, so I'm going to darken the corners a little. Oh, I didn't hit apply. I do that every time I use this tool. Now, if you go too far, obviously, it looks like you're looking through a porthole. You don't want that far. So somewhere in there, don't forget to hit apply. You know, the other thing I've noticed is there appears to be a bit of a gradient to this image. It's a little darker in its corner than this color. Those sort of things you can do in tools like Photoshop, but this dealing with light pollution, for example, is really a strong argument for using something like APP or PixInsight that have great tools for gradient removal. There is a plugin for Photoshop called Gradient Exterminator with an X. And it's a plugin you can buy for Photoshop that will help remove these gradients also. Now, somewhere, if you look here, and if this is Affinity Photo, but it does have something for where you can load in Photoshop plugins. I've never tried that, so I don't know if the Gradient Exterminator plugin made for Adobe Photoshop would work as a plugin with this tool. I don't know if it has a free trial. It might be something you could try, but anyway. And with that tool, you would basically go in and, yeah, you would go in with this selection tool, and you can see I'm drawing a box here. I mean, not a box. I circled an area, and you would circle, oops. Okay, I don't know how to do it, and I don't know the keystrokes, but you know, let's say you think that's a background area, and let's see, drag Control Alt. Okay, so I can draw another. What?
I just did a search, and
Is it
the
just alt?
gradient exterminator is now compatible with Affinity Photo
Oh,
as well.
great. So what I'm trying to do is there's a way you can draw this circle and then add another circle and then add this area to the selection. So the selection would be all those areas. And then you would run the plugin and it would look at these background areas and then the rest of the image, and it would figure out the light pollution gradient and remove it. So that's something maybe we could visit in another meeting, but I'm going to stop there. Again, this is more just sort of showing the buttons, the click and everything. It's not necessarily, this is not a good image by any means. But just using the tools in hand, this is kind of the state I left it at. If you were in a really dark location, you probably wouldn't have a lot of these issues. If you're dealing with a lot of light pollution, then, you know, one way people generally deal with these problems is you just try to hide them, right? You would just take the black point and just clip everything that you don't like and just show the parts that you do like. And that works, but you know, there's a lot of hidden detail in this image that would be nice to pull out. So that's where being able to remove the light gradient is really handy. Well, let me stop there and see if there's questions or comments at this point.
Great review. I was glad to see that DSS is still supported, even though I don't use it very much anymore. And yeah, so that's kind of nice that they kept it alive.
Yeah. Yeah, let me show you. So for laughs, so I did no background calibration. The thing that everything recommended was to do this RGB background calibration. And this is what was recommended and about everything I read. It only takes a second to restack it because there's only 8 frames. It doesn't have to redo all the calibration and all that if you just restack the data with different settings because everything's been calibrated already. So it's going to make as I said before, it's going to write a new file out. But this one's called autosave.tiff. This next one is going to be called autosave001.tiff. So that means it did not overwrite the previous one.
Because you have your handy little checkbox stuff.
Yep. So if I load this guy, a lot of the color looks better. It just already. And if you look here, it's almost all white, meaning the red, black, the red, the green, and the blue channels were shifted so that they all coincide with each other, which is what you want. So this is probably a better way to handle this.
Yeah, it looks more natural to me there based on that.
If I
Out of the
stretch
gate,
it, however,
right?
you can see the background has a really strong red cast to it. I don't know if that's showing up in.
Yeah, I see. It's probably your flats, right? That.
Yeah. So aside from that problem, I think probably using that setting would be better for like a DSLR. But you can see, yeah, if you're looking at this area, you know, the color of these reflection nebulae look a little better. So again, all I did there was you don't want to use this per channel unless you're doing like narrowband filters, which I don't think anyone here would be doing. I clicked on this RGB channels background calibration. It's under the light tab of the stacking parameters that popped up. And then this thing that looks, I didn't see it for a long time because I thought it was a label. But anything that has like a kind of bluish color compared to black, apparently is a button. And I picked RGB channels background calibration. So there's something you can experiment with. Yeah, hopefully either I'll find a good data set or I'm going to I thought about this too late. There's some nice data sets online that I probably should have just pointed everyone at. So I'll try to find a nice one and redo this, and I'll send out an email pointing at that data set.
There's an email on the list, I think, earlier this week about someone who had released a whole bunch of data.
Yeah, I sent that one out.
Oh, that was you. I
That's
remember reading it. But.
Yeah, I started to look at it, and the guy was like, well, you can use it, but do not redistribute it. And so I was like, well, we'll just do this today. But
Right.
all right. Yeah,
So
I'm going
for
to keep
that-
using Affinity Photo for all my processing. I'm going to try to wean myself off Photoshop for a while.
And I will
So I
say
can-
this about Affinity: I haven't used it as much myself, but if you don't want to pay the Photoshop tax, it's a really inexpensive program. It's like $50, and it's a one-time fee. You don't have to pay every month. So
That's right.
It's really loaded. So.
Well, I pay the tax because I also use Lightroom a lot. And so, and Affinity doesn't have a version of Lightroom. So for things like time lapses and stuff like that, Lightroom is really useful.
Yeah, they're all good options. I'm more interested in it basically to just find something that people can use.
Agreed.
And not if you start using Photoshop, it's a few dollars a month, and then you like it, and then you have to decide, do you want to pay that the rest of your life or not? That's a personal decision. So I'm just trying to find some options. My version of Photoshop is ancient. It's from 2005, and it works great. All the images you see me make, I use that. But Affinity has some really neat features in it that my old Photoshop doesn't. So it's kind of fun to play with. Sorry, George.
Go ahead.
The updates for Affinity is also free. I mean, they continuously update Affinity Photo, and they give it to you when you start Affinity. It checks for updates, and I've got the update for a whole year, and it's pretty good because they keep working on it.
Yeah, and they both have Windows. It has Windows, Mac, and Mac versions as well, and it also has an iPad version, so you can actually load it on your iPad. I think that one is a different cost. You have to buy it from the App Store, but it's like $20 or something like that for the iPad version. But it's kind of nice that you can do it on your iPad too. So.
Well, it sounds like that Infinity is actively being developed and improved. Is that a good statement?
Yes.
That's fair.
Yeah, I read the forums trying to learn how to use it for this, and there's a lot of Adobe refugees, as how I'll describe them, that are decided they're not going to pay every month to use it. And there's some things you can't do in Affinity easily that you can do in Adobe yet, but they seem responsive. I don't know, Jordan, is that what you think? Or
yes, Affinity is very responsive. They make changes, they listen, they look at the forums. As Mike said, there are certain things in Adobe like the HSL, which I think works much more intuitively in Adobe, but they're going to make changes. The only thing that it doesn't have compared to Lightroom, for instance, is that there's no digital asset management tool. It's purely an editing tool. So if you were to scroll through 100 images, you can't use Affinity. I use ACDC to scroll through my images, and then whatever I want to edit, I put it into Affinity. But I find Affinity very, very good, really very good for $50.
and there's some incredible YouTube videos.
Yes.
There's a few people that have channels that if you just invested the time to look at, you could learn how to do much of the stuff. Of course, Photoshop has a lot of videos too, probably more, but it's not one of these cheap programs that is real esoteric and no one uses it and you're stuck by yourself.
Right. There's quite a bit of features in some of the other tabs, which Mike hasn't even shown yet. When you open up a raw file, it goes to the, I can't remember the name of the tab, but it's not the actual editing. So you process your raw file there. And there are a lot of things that can be done in Affinity. It's quite a powerful program for $50. I mean, I've weaned myself from Photoshop, but since they switched over to the monthly fee business model. So I think Affinity is a strong contender for post-processing.
So now I know this whole thing is not about Affinity, but I did want to ask a question since you guys seem to have used it more than I have. Have you had much luck with Photoshop actions being imported into Affinity and working well?
I have not tried using Photoshop
Okay.
Actions.
Yeah.
There might be some way to do it, but I have not really tried it. I just want to, just do raw, whatever Affinity
Right.
feature is.
Because I could see that possibly being something that would hold people back, because if they're using like astronomy actions and other such that were developed for Photoshop, I could see them wanting to stick with some of those for some of their stuff. But I was just curious more than anything.
No, I haven't tried it.
I've never used Actions. I just do it. So,
They're
yeah,
not all
I
as
don't,
smart as you.
I don't know what Adobe is. Is it $9, $10 a month now, or anyway? I mean, you could almost fund PixInsight after a year and a half of that. So, it's just a question of what you want to do. But, I think you need a program to stack with, and DSS works. I'm going to really invest more time in Cyril, SIRIL. I think it's got a lot of promise, and that's what I'm going to focus on for now on. And then you
Cyril
need, oh, sorry, Jordan.
Cyril is great. I mean,
Yeah.
I've stopped using DSS. I've switched over to Cyril, although I have not explored a lot of the features, but the processing is so much more intuitive in Cyril in the sense that it just goes through it, and the output right away is very good. In fact, you can almost do all the editing in Cyril without having to go to Affinity Photo or Photoshop.
Yes.
It's that good in the sense. I'm not sure which one is more supported. I know Cyril just, it's an old program, but it's it just recently received its 0.996 version, and it's still beta. I'm not sure which one is better supported, but both of them are free, and I found Cyril to be really good in stacking.
I played with it quickly, and I didn't quite get the results I wanted, but that's just because I'm not familiar with it. But I saw, for example, the light pollution tool that looked pretty sophisticated. That I think, and Cyril's free also. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with things. That's not, we didn't talk about that today, but I had a lot of interest from that survey in DeepSkyStacker. So I wanted to just cover that base, but I'm going to be transitioning to Cyril and Affinity, and just sort of trying to eat my own dog food, I guess, and then give some workshops on that, and let, kind of try to help people who are starting out with the tools they use. Because it always feels like a sledgehammer to go, oh yeah, it picks insight, use, and then there's 50 tools, and then you have a perfect image. That's not really translating to someone who's never done this. So I'm trying to bridge that gap, I think. So, all right. Well, maybe Jordan can give us a workshop on Affinity Photo something. Or Cyril, maybe.
I can do Cyril and Affinity Photo maybe next time, but there's still quite a bit of features.
We'll get there. Yeah.
I haven't touched, but it's very good. I mean, I like it.
Now again, if you're using PixInsight in Photoshop and you love it, this is no reason to change. It is, those are the best tools still, for sure. Just like, Nina is great, but if you're using something else, stick with what works for you. It's just trying to highlight some alternatives in case you want to try something new. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. As always, just shoot me emails if you have a question. And yeah, I'll probably post something with a different data set during the week. And if you want to give that a shot, that'll be something you can play with. So
We can use your data set in DeepSkyStacker and play with it. That's the thought.
I didn't catch that. Sorry, Jerry.
I said, if you post your data, could we use that data and try it in the DeepSkyStacker on our own systems here?
Yeah, if you look at the meeting announcement, I put it in there, the link to it.
Okay.
The one I announced yesterday, or yesterday. If you don't see it, just email me and I can send you a link.
Okay.
All right. Well, you guys have a good afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Michael. I
Thank you
appreciate
very
your time.
much, Mike, for your time.
Sure thing.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Everybody have a good night. See you later.